So September the 3rd, a little more than 2 months ago, we were examining the gnosis of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's management of Allah's kingdom. And we were doing this by exploring the concepts of divine governance, drawing parallels between the way humans perform actions and how Allah Azza wa Jal manages the universe. We stepped away from that and we studied the fiqh, the Islamic law, the Islamic jurisprudence around issues of being a musafir, a traveler, around being a muqim, a resident versus being a traveler. How far do you have to travel? What are the conditions? What it really means? How to join prayers, when they can be joined and shortened and when they can be joined and not shortened, jami. So you got to have a taste of what our scholars go through in an effort to actually make life very simple for us. In fact, sometimes it ends up being very complicated. Let's go back to where we're picking back up today, alhamdulillah. We look at the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commands are carried out, how angels obey, how affairs are managed in the universe, and how elements of creation are orchestrated. This gives us an experiential understanding of Allah. We want to have gnosis. We want to know Allah. To know yourself is to know Allah. We want to know Allah. We want to understand Allah. So I remind myself and I remind you that there are three types of gnosis. Experiential knowledge, the knowledge of God's essence. Thus, we have had many classes, 67 in fact, of the I.S.L.A.M of Allah have been addressed in great detail, and they are all available on our YouTube site. The knowledge of Allah's attributes. So this is sort of one of those places where things sort of run together. And the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's acts, how Allah orchestrates things. And these correspond to the understanding God's fundamental nature, his qualities, and the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala governs the world. And we look to those things in order to look at the essence of how we are to run our world. And that sort of leads into what we will begin to talk about later on today, which is sovereignty. God's sovereignty, we started talking about this again, versus our sovereignty. Gnosis of the self is the key to all of this. Just as self-knowledge is emphasized as the key to understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's essence and attributes, it is also the key to comprehending his acts of governance. We are told that there are signs in us and there are signs in the universe. So understanding how one rules their own domain provides insight into how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala governs the universe. And I will say that if we were more focused on governing our own domains instead of controlling other people and what they do and having a problem with what they do that we don't like, we would be in a much better place spiritually. So understanding how Allah rules and how we rule our own domains, how he rules his domain, is what gives us insight into how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually governs the universe. We looked at this analogical explanation of writing Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I don't know how many of you might remember that, to illustrate the sequence of events that occur when an action is performed. And we compared that to how actions are performed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we are reminded that it starts with desire. And from that desire, we can create an intention. It's desire and will. And that intention can be that I will serve Allah or I will serve my nafs. And it's very simple. It's either or. In this area, there's really no gray matter. Either I am making my intention to do what Allah has told me, or I'm making my intention to satisfy my own ego and my own nafs. So it starts with desire and will, and then it involves movement. And if I remember correctly, the Arabic word haraka, movement, it's how you move letters. The vowel on that letter is representing, if I remember correctly, the haraka, how you move. So after you have been given that freedom of will and you have a desire, it involves the movement of spirit from heart to brain. And so it's so important that our heart be filled with Quran and Sunnah, because that's the first place that we want to look when we are making an Islamic decision. So again, it starts with desire and will, involves the movement of spirit from the heart to the brain. Notice what's first, ruh, spirit. What a lot of people do, let me think about how I can get what Allah doesn't want me to have. Literally, people will sit down and spend a whole lot of time trying to figure out how they can get a loophole around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The parallel to divine action is compared to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will is executed in the universe. Allah has told us again, He showed us signs within ourselves and signs in the universe. So just as a person desires initiates an action, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will initiates events. And we don't question those events, because we know that in the wisdom of God, whatever comes to a Muslim, it could be part of their test. Allah promised that He would test us with our lives, with our fruit, with our wealth. So just as a person's desire initiates an action, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will initiates events. All of these events come to us to increase us in faith, not to take us away from faith. The spirit that carries out the divine will is like the angel or divine agents who transmit the effects of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. And this is very powerful. Because when you take this a little deeper and you look at the creation, we as Muslims know that we do not have the capacity to create. And sometimes it upsets artists or artistic people when I say this. They're offended. But to create is to start with nothing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given all these mediums to different artists that use them to express themselves. But we do not create. There is a hierarchy of order in divine governance. Just as the spirit activates various parts of the body to execute an action. Angels are seen as carrying out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's commands from the throne to the pedestal. And the pedestal representative of the earth, the throne obviously where Allah is seated above, as we say metaphorically, all of this, orchestrating all of this. And then when we talked about the preserved tablets and creation, just as an idea forms in the brain before being transferred to the nerves and executed by the hand, forms of all things first appear in the preserved tablets, a metaphysical concept, and then they manifest in the physical world. So if you think about it, your eyes see a material thing of this world, and your heart and your brain goes to work. The brain is stimulated by what the eyes saw, what the ears heard, what the mouth tasted, what the hand touched. When that happens, if I go to my heart and I make the decision, I will please Allah. If I go to my brain and I'm operating based on sensory intake, I am not going to be pleasing Allah. So just as an idea forms in the brain before being transferred to the nerves and executed by the limbs of the body, forms of all things first appear in the preserved tablets, a metaphysical concept, and then they manifest in the physical world so that we can see the signs in them. Elements and governance connects the movement of the elements, heat, cold, water, and earth, to the actions of the angels. Just as these elements move ink to create words, they are directed by the angels to shape various aspects of the physical world. So here we see a correlation, how the angels do nothing but serve Allah. They do not have will. And the correlation we need to see is that Allah's intention is for us to copy this, for us to make ourselves higher than the angels. We have the capacity to surpass them if we only obey Allah and our heart completely surrenders to Allah, and this brain surrenders to the brain of the heart. And then we talked about the matter of mastery and control. And just as a person manages their body through their heart's control, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala managed the universe through his mastery of the throne. And we'll see a verse in chapter 10, verse 3, that tells us Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala established himself upon the throne, directing all things. And this is in chapter 10, verse 3. So the concept of God's residence in the throne is analogous to how a person is perceived to reside in their spiritual heart. Our heart should be ruling us. And this is perhaps why 5 times a day when we pray, and 17 times minimum that we go into sujood, that we realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on the throne directing all things, and therefore I will be grateful to whatever comes to me. And then this actually represents and reinforces the idea of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's supreme governance over creation. Even though we may not accept it and we may resist it, there is this correlation that is very powerful and, for me, very graphic. The complexity of divine governance and control underscores the interconnectedness between human actions and divine management, suggesting that understanding the former can provide insights into the latter. And I want for my brothers and sisters what I want for myself. I want to see these things. I want to see these signs and understand these signs, because in that I know that my iman, my faith, is increased. And so when we think about our sovereignty and Allah's sovereignty, in order to manage something, one has to be given supreme authority, jurisdiction, power, and dominion. And Allah said, I created men and jinn for naught except to worship me. So Allah has given us, he made us the Khalifa of the universe, the property managers of the world, and we're supposed to do that according to the way that Allah managed the universe. We're supposed to follow those principles. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us freedom of will, self-rule, and this leads us to the object of the examination of the equaling of human sovereignty with the sovereignty of Allah. And then it's really interesting because Imam Ghazali makes a very small presentation, which I hope that I can share with you and then break it down, a few little presentations that he makes addressing this, so that we can take these essence, this principles, and apply them in our life, and that we can elevate in our ranks as seekers of the divine in pursuit of the alchemy of happiness. So in all of that, Al-Ghazali has said in explaining the equaling of human sovereignty with the sovereignty of Allah Most High, reference was made to 2 kinds of tremendous knowledge. One is the knowledge of the human self and the nature of the connection between human organs to its power and attributes, and the nature of the connection of its attributes and powers to the heart. And he says this is a lengthy study. And I would say that really and truly, I'm going to, for metaphorical example, I'm going to say this is like the lengthy study of perhaps a master's degree. And then he talks about the other concerns, the relationship of the kingdom of the king of the world to the angels, the relationship of the angels to one another, and the relationship of the heavens, the throne, and the pedestal to them. And this study is like a PhD study. I think that's just sort of a way to help us understand the gravity of what we're trying to grasp in order to have a sustainable faith, a faith of certitude, where we are certain of our relationship with Allah and that we absolutely count on Allah and depend on Allah and know that Allah will only send that which is good for us. The object of these things that we allude to, or these allusions or references, is so long as the person is astute, for him or her to believe in all these things, and through that belief come to know the greatness of Allah Most High. For him or her who is dull-witted, or I'm going to say slothful here, lazy about studying the religion, taking a chance. People say, I just don't understand. And I will often say to people, have you tried? Have you just sat down with one verse and said, Allah, show me what this means. Show me a pearl. Or read 5 verses and said, what's speaking to me? So for that person who might be slothful, at least this much is to appreciate how negligent and how defrauded they are to be deprived of the contemplation of such a presence with so much beauty. You are truly deprived. We are deprived if we do not participate in tadabbur, in contemplation and reflection of the na'am of Allah, what Allah has given to us and where Allah has brought us out of. Many of us were on the brink of the hellfire because we believed in shirk and we practiced shirk, and Allah Azza wa Jal brought us out of that. What knowledge do people have of the beauty of the divine presence itself? In other words, the thing that we should be able to talk about the most is Allah's presence and how we understand it, how we know the 99 names of Allah. And this is perhaps why the Ahadith tell us that if you know the 99 names of Allah, you will be guaranteed paradise. And there's an argument as to whether that just means memorizing or actually knowing. And I deem by Allah, Allah knows best, Allahu A'lam, that it's to really know Allah. It's a methodology encouraging us and inspiring us to know Allah as Allah has described Allah. And what itself is that amount which has been said of all this so that people may be able to understand. So here we see Imam Ghazali, interestingly enough, takes this interesting and abrupt turn in the alchemy of happiness and begins a conversation about comparison of the naturalist and the astrologer to the ants. And so often when you first start to read Imam Ghazali, you think, where does this come from? And you realize that he's looking for signs in himself and signs in the universe. And he's looking at everything with the eyes of Allah. And this is one of the greatest definitions of taqwa, to be a person that is God conscious. It means that I am conscious of God in every single thing that I see, whether it is a test for me, whether I think in my head up here that it's good or bad, I know that it's from Allah. So he says, the helpless appalling, awful, atrocious naturalist and the deprived astrologer assign affairs to aspects of nature and the stars. So everything is called Mother Nature. They use that, and they talk about the stars. And he says they are like ants traveling over a piece of paper. Now, a lot of people would say, what has this got to do with Islam? Hang on, and you will see how if you see Allah in everything, you can take a piece of paper and you can literally learn something from Allah if your intention is to do so. You ask Allah to show you the signs of that piece of paper. And you could go many, many avenues. You could look at the miracle of the Quran that talks about the trees. And I've done classes on this. But he says that these deprived astrologers and naturalists, they are like ants traveling over a piece of paper. They see the paper and they watch it become black and patterns emerge on it. Now, we have probably been there before if we had a back porch or something and we left fruit out or something, the ants come and they make a little trail. He looks at things like this and he looks for the signs of Allah in them. He says, they see the pinpoint and they become glad, exclaiming, we know the truth of this matter. The pen is making this drawing. This is a natural metaphor of them not knowing anything about motion except the very lowest part. And the more that we contemplate, the more deeply we're able to go. And this is why we talk about stations, maqam in Islam, ranks. We want to elevate in our ranks as seekers of the divine. Then he says another ant comes upon the scene whose eyes are wider and able to see further. So you stop and you think, now, is he talking about the physical eyes or is he talking about the spiritual eyes? So another ant comes upon the scene whose eyes are wider and able to see further. He says, you are mistaken. I see that this pen is being used. I see something else beyond it making the drawing. This pleased them, and they continued. The truth is that I have learned that the artist is a finger, not the pen. The pen is controlled by the finger. Now, what happens is a lot of times when people start looking at things like this, they get a little frustrated because it requires a very deep introspection, insight, and a willingness to jump in there and think about this. So here, this is a parable of the astrologer who sees even farther. They have learned that nature is controlled by the celestial bodies, but they have not learned that the celestial bodies are controlled by the angels at levels beyond, which they have not penetrated. So the same way that in this world, we live in a three-dimensional world, in the next world, we will live in more than 3 dimensions. We will see things we have never seen. We will hear things we've never heard. We will be exposed to things that we have no idea could exist. At this disparity, or as this disparity has occurred between the astrologer and the naturalist in the physical world, and from it a dispute, the same dispute that has arisen between those who have progressed in the world of spirits, because most people who have progressed from the physical world and have found something outside of their physical body have halted at the first step, and the way to the ascension to the world of spirits has been closed to them. And this is why I keep encouraging you. And I know that some people feel like that's what I'm teaching. The shaitan whispers to you that it's not attainable. And all I encourage you to do is to test that message and see if that's a message from Allah or is that a message from the shayateen. Because Allah would not ask us to do what He didn't give us the potential to do. In the world of spirits, which is the world of lights, there are steep passes and many veils covering the stairs, covering that road of evolution or elevation. And some of those steps are like stars, others are like the moon, and others are like the sun. And these steps of the ascension are for those to whom the kingdom of heaven is shown. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Ibrahim I.S.L.A.M in Surah 6 of the Holy Quran in the 75th verse, and thus we showed Abraham the kingdom of the heavens and the earth. To the point he said, and this is just a few verses later, 4 verses later in verse 79, he said, lo, I have turned my face, my countenance, my whole self toward Him, my personality, toward Allah, who created the heavens and the earth. So the same way that Allah Azza wa Jal showed Ibrahim alayhi this, He is willing to show us. We might not get to the same level. Of course we won't, because he was a prophet. May Allah be pleased with him. But it is for this reason, and I want you to just get real comfortable in your seat for a minute. Because it is for this reason that our beloved Prophet ﷺ said, Allah has 70 veils of light. If He removed them, The radiant splendors of his countenance would consume with fire all who gaze upon him. So imagine these 70 veils that I just want to move so that I can get closer to Allah, as close as I can get to him without being incinerated. Imagine that thought. I want to get as close to you as I can, Allah Azza wa Jal, without getting incinerated. The point is that we understand that the poor naturalist who assigns everything to heat and cold is right in their subjective reality and in their context. If they were not the intermediaries for divine causes, medicine or medical science would be useless. But they made a mistake due to their short-sightedness and did not return to the way of Islam. They were stuck in their belief system, in their philosophy. And many of us are stuck in our beliefs. We have beliefs that we adopted as children or even as young adults before our amygdalas were developed, and even sometimes after because of trauma. And we made decisions about those events that are contrary to Islam, and therefore those events still own us today, and they still control us today. They halted at the first landing stage and made of it a foundation, not a thing to be used. They made it the Lord. They made their observation the Lord, not a servant, whilst it is one of the lowest of servants in the rank of footgear. The astrologer was correct about including the stars among the causes. If that were not so, day and night would be the same. For the sun is a star, the source of the light and warmth of the world. And winter and summer would be the same. For the heat of the summer is because the sun is near the zenith of the sky, while in winter it is further away. And when we look at our spiritual warmth as opposed to our spiritual coldness, when we are sometimes angry with God because of our ignorance, then we get cold spiritually. And then when God gives us a favor, we get warm. And then as soon as he sends us a little test, we turn to ourselves instead of Allah. And that Lord who has the power to create such a hot and bright sun, would it be strange if Allah created Saturn cold and dry, and he created Venus hot and moist? And Imam Ghazali says this does not detract from Islam. But the astrologer has erred where they had made of the stars the first principle and locus of empowerment, and have not realized or understood what Allah said in Surah 7, verse 54, the sun and the moon and the stars are subservient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command. Something subservient is that which is employed by others. And so if you think that this is subservient to Allah's commands, instead of us looking at Allah's commands, some people will look in the newspaper to find out what their future is like. May Allah guide us away from that kind of ignorance. Hence, the stars are workers, not for themselves, but are employed as agents of the angels. Our extremities are to be employed by the heart of Allah, the heart of Islam. Just as the nerves are used to activate parts of the body by the power which is in the brain. The stars are among the lowest or the lowliest of servants, even though they are at the level of captains, like the four temperaments, and not at the level of shoes. We talked about foot soldiers. They are like lowly servants, resembling the relationship of the pen to writing. And here we can look at this, a star in comparison to Allah. So let me try to break this down. I love to just share with you and then break it down and simplify it and explain it in more simple terms. So here we see an analogy discussing the perspectives and limitations of naturalists and astrologers in understanding the workings of the natural world and the cosmos. Al-Ghazali uses the metaphor of ants on a piece of paper to illustrate 7 points. And we'll see how many of the 7 points you got. And this is why I want to do this for you. I want to show you something, and then I want to show you all the points that you can get from such a short piece of writing. So he talks first about the helpless naturalist, the execrable, extremely appalling naturalist represents individuals who study and explain natural phenomena solely based on observable physical causes such as heat and cold. They are described as being like ants on a piece of paper who see patterns emerging but attribute them only to the pen, physical causes, and not the artist's higher or divine causes. Naturalists understand and analyze the physical world, but do not recognize or consider deeper, non-physical factors that may influence. They are unfaithful. They are guilty of infidelity to their owner and their creator. Number two, he talked about the deprived astrologer, referring to those who engage in astrology and attribute events and outcomes to the positions of celestial bodies like stars and planets. And we could even go further to say the tea leaf reader, who, makes some tea, swishes it around, throws the tea out, and then tries to tell you what that means. Like the ant, they observe the paper, the world, and attribute everything to the pen, celestial bodies. We think about the kalam of Allah, the speech of Allah. We think about the pen that Allah talks about, representing how the knowledge was brought to us of Quran and Sunnah. However, they do not go beyond this perspective to understand that there might be a higher force or higher forces at play, represented by the artist beyond the pen. And then he talks about the ant that comes along with wider eyes, wider vision, comes along and suggests that there is something more significant than just the pen at work. The ant represents those who delve deeper into their understanding and realize that there are higher levels or causes in the context, angels or divine forces controlling the natural world and celestial bodies. The astrologer who understands this is akin to the ant with wider eyes. He says, yes, we have all these things, but there's another force. There's a spiritual side to things. He then talks in this little short writing about dispute. This is number 4 in spiritual progress. Just as there is a dispute between the naturalist and the astrologer in the physical world, a similar dispute arises among those who progress into the world of spirits or seek a deeper understanding of the cosmos, inshallah, for the sake of Allah. Most people, it is implied, stop at the first level of understanding and do not explore the higher levels of spiritual or metaphysical knowledge. And that first level of understanding, unfortunately, is often what is spoon-fed to a person. It does not necessarily come with the proofs and the dalil that you need, and therefore you can easily be misguided. The 5th point that he makes here, he talks about the steep passes and the veils. When we think of steep passes and veils in the world of spirits, it represents the barriers or levels of understanding that one must overcome to reach a deeper understanding of the universe, where Allah says he's shown us signs. These barriers are compared to steps, with some being like stars, some like the moon, and some like the sun, each symbolizing different levels of enlightenment and spiritual awareness. So I share this with you because it is my prayer, it is my goal for you, inshallah, if you share it, that you do elevate in your ranks as a seeker of the divine, and that you are able to see the veils of light that are available to you in this world. So the 6th point, Imam Ghazali talks about the veils of light. The reference of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala having 70 veils of light implies that the ultimate truth or divine knowledge is veiled from ordinary human perception. Removing these veils would result in a revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's glory that could overwhelm mortal beings. And this is why we want to specifically be moving towards Allah Azza wa Jal with attainable, realistic, reasonable, measurable goals, so that we don't bite off more than we chew and then are overwhelmed. And I've seen, this is why I tell reverts over and over and over again, Islam prescribed a middle road, not to the east, not to the west, but a balance, a road of al-mazan. So removing these veils have to be done at levels, at stations, little by little. And the seventh point he made with regards to the role of the naturalists and the astrologers, the passage concludes by acknowledging the roles of naturalists and astrologers in understanding the physical world. Naturalists, in their focus on physical causes, have a valid place in scientific inquiry. Astrologers also have a point in recognizing the influence of celestial bodies on the world. However, both groups are criticized for not going beyond their initial perspectives to recognize higher controlling forces. And if you think that if you look at the essence of knowing that at 120 days in your mother's womb, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala breathed the soul into you, and that you came out, 85% of us came out of our mother's womb in prostration to Allah with our head below our heart, so that our heart would rule our head. And Allah says, let there be no change in this fitra. We are working to go back to that perfect state that we came into this world. So Al-Ghazali uses the analogy of ants on a paper to critique the limitations of naturalistic and astrological worldviews, and emphasizes the need for the wide eyes, the deeper spiritual and metaphysical understanding beyond the observable physical world. We have to have the wide eyes, the spiritual eyes that gives us the wide angle lens according to Allah's perspective and celestial influences. And then we will talk about it a little more next week. I'll give you just a little bit. Imam Ghazali takes another turn and he writes about the causes of dispute. And so just by looking at what we've covered today, the Prophet ﷺ said in the latter days, people will value their opinions more than they do relationships. So what we find is that masajids break up because one person wants their opinion to rule instead of looking at the opinion of Allah. And so I will look forward to talking about this, inshallah, next week, the causes of dispute upon people, inshallah. And I would invite you to begin to ponder and reflect about this this week. And I would like to send out something this week. I know that with the Thanksgiving weekend, if people are going to be traveling, you know, and we're not going to have anyone for class, if you guys could just let me know, maybe at the end of class, we can talk about that. Otherwise, I do have the class prepared for next week, inshallah. And if we don't want to do it next week, then we can do it on the next time that we have a class. So I want to remind you that I love you all for the sake of Allah. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Transcendent are you, O Allah, and praise be to you as you praise yourself. I bear witness that there is no deity except you, and I seek your forgiveness, and I repent to you.